It was 1998, and I was working as a paramedic. I opted to work the night shift to allow me to attend classes during the day. Working the night shift was usually routine. Accidents, heart attacks, the usual medical emergencies. But this one night, man, it was like a scene out of a horror movie. My partner, Ryan, and I were halfway through our shift when the call came in, a mysterious medical emergency at an old mansion on the outskirts of town. Now, this wasn't our usual run-of-the-mill call, and the dispatcher's voice had a tense edge to it that made my skin crawl. We hopped in the ambulance, lights flashing, and sped towards the mansion. The night was pitch black, the road twisting through dense woods. The air felt heavy, like a storm was brewing, but there wasn't a cloud in the sky. As we approached the mansion, it loomed out of the darkness like something from another era, all turrets and Gothic architecture. The place looked straight out of a haunted house brochure, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were walking into a horror movie set. We parked the ambulance, grabbed our gear, and entered the mansion. The atmosphere inside was thick with an unsettling quiet, broken only by the distant hum of medical equipment. A butler-type guy guided us through dimly lit corridors until we reached a room that looked like it belonged in a medieval castle. And there he was, our patient, a frail old man lying in an ornate bed. His eyes darted around the room as if he could see something we couldn't. The family huddled in the corner, whispering like they were afraid to disturb the eerie calm. The old man was hooked up to all sorts of machines, but his vitals seemed oddly stable. Ryan and I exchanged glances, both feeling like we'd stepped into a Twilight Zone episode. We approached the bed, and the old man's eyes locked onto mine. It sent a chill down my spine. His family explained that he'd been having night terrors, screaming about shadows and unseen entities tormenting him. They were convinced it was something beyond the realm of conventional medicine. Now we were used to odd cases, but this one felt different. As we assessed the old man, his eyes never left me. He spoke in hushed whispers about things that made no sense, ancient rituals, curses, and a darkness that followed him from his past. I chalked it up to delirium, but deep down I couldn't shake the feeling that something more sinister was at play. The family insisted we transport him to the hospital for further evaluation. We prepared to move him when suddenly the lights flickered and a bone-chilling cold swept through the room. The old man's eyes widened and he clutched my arm with surprising strength. In that moment, a shadowy figure materialized at the foot of the bed. It was like nothing I'd ever seen, a humanoid silhouette, featureless and dark as the night. The room seemed to pulsate with a malevolent energy. I felt a sudden wave of nausea, and Ryan stumbled back, his face drained of color. The old man's family recoiled in horror, and I swear I heard a guttural growl emanating from the shadows. Panic set in, and we fumbled for our equipment, desperate to get the old man out of there. As we loaded him into the ambulance, the shadowy figure lingered, watching with an otherworldly intensity. The old man clung to consciousness, muttering cryptic warnings about the darkness following him. The drive to the hospital was tense. The old man's condition remained stable, but the shadow seemed to trail us, dancing at the edge of our peripheral vision. I radioed to Ryan, who was driving to see how soon we'd arrive at the hospital. "About 3 minutes," he responded. His voice was shaky and mirrored the fear that gnawed at my own gut. We rushed the old man into the emergency room, and as the hospital staff took over, the shadow dissipated. The old man's family, visibly shaken, clung to the hope that modern medicine could provide answers. Ryan and I left the hospital in silence, the weight of the night settling on our shoulders. We never talked about what happened that night, but the memory haunted us both. The old man's family reached out weeks later, thanking us for our efforts. They claimed the night terrors had subsided, and the old man seemed at peace in his final days. But every now and then, I catch myself glancing into the shadows, half expecting that otherworldly presence to reappear. This was definitely a night on the job that defied explanation, a dance with shadows in the eerie corridors of a mansion lost to time. It's a memory that lingers, a reminder that even in the world of medicine there are mysteries that defy the light of day. This was one of the creepiest nights of my life. I worked as a flight attendant back in the early 2000s. It was a routine red-eye flight and most passengers were snoozing or zoning out to in-flight movies. I was working the night shift, serving peanuts and soft drinks with the obligatory smile. The plane hummed with a dull, steady rhythm as passengers nestled into their seats, eager to reach their destination by morning. Somewhere in the middle of the flight, I noticed a passenger who stood out like a sore thumb. He was seated in the back, hunched over, with a fedora pulled low, covering his face. Now, it's not unusual for people to try and catch some shut-eye during a red-eye, but this guy gave off a creepy vibe. I made my way down the aisle, offering refreshments and doing the usual flight attendant routine. Most passengers nodded or smiled in acknowledgement, but not Mr. Fedora. He simply stared, his eyes hidden in the shadows beneath his hat. As the night went on, I found myself passing by Mr. Fedora more than once. Each time, he seemed more and more out of place, like a character from an old noir film. The other passengers dozed off, oblivious to the growing unease settling in the cabin. During one of my rounds, Mr. Fedora beckoned me over with a subtle nod. I obliged, leaning in to hear what he had to say. His voice was low, almost a whisper, as he asked for a cup of hot black coffee. Now, that request might seem ordinary, but the way he said it truly creeped me out. I retreated to the galley to prepare the coffee, trying to shake off the weird feeling. The airplane's hum and the distant murmurs of passengers became a disconcerting backdrop to my thoughts. I couldn't put my finger on it, but something about Mr. Fedora had set my nerves on edge. When I returned with the coffee, I noticed he had shifted seats. Now, he was in the very last row, the dim light accentuating the mystery surrounding him. I handed over the coffee, and that's when I caught a glimpse of his eyes, piercing and intense like he could see straight through me. As the flight continued, I couldn't shake the feeling that Mr. Fedora was watching my every move. I did my best to focus on my duties, checking on passengers, and maintaining a professional demeanor. But every time I glanced toward the back, his gaze seemed fixed on me. As we approached the final leg of the flight, the unease in the cabin became indisputable. Even the most seasoned flight attendants exchanged glances, sensing that something wasn't right. The atmosphere was thick with a silent tension. With only a short time until landing, I decided to check on Mr. Fedora one last time. The coffee cup sat untouched, and he continued to stare, unblinking. This time, he spoke, his voice sending a chill down my spine. "Did you know," he began, "that every red-eye flight is a journey between worlds?" His words hung in the air, the plane's hum drowning out the gasps of nearby passengers. I stammered, unsure how to respond. His eyes bore into mine, and it felt as if time itself had come to a standstill. He spoke of a secret realm that exists in the dead of night, where the boundaries between the living and the unknown blur. As he delved into his strange narrative, passengers around us began to stir, sensing the peculiar conversation unfolding. Mr. Fedora's words became a surreal monologue about the mysteries of the red-eye flights, a portal for those willing to peer into the abyss. I excused myself, retreating to the front of the cabin, where my fellow flight attendants traded worried glances. The plane descended into an eerie silence, broken only by the low hum of the engines. As we touched down and passengers disembarked, I stole one last glance toward the back of the plane. Mr. Fedora had vanished, leaving behind a cold, empty seat. The other flight attendants and I exchanged bewildered looks, unsure if we had just witnessed a bizarre encounter or succumbed to a shared hallucination. Still, to this day, I can't explain what happened that night. The flight continued on its schedule, passengers filed out, and life resumed its ordinary course. But the memory of Mr. Fedora, the mysterious passenger who spoke of a twilight realm, lingers in the recesses of my mind, casting a shadow over every red-eye flight I've worked since. It was just another graveyard shift, the city draped in a quiet stillness that only midnight can bring. I was patrolling the dimly lit streets, the only company the occasional flicker of a distant street lamp. The radio crackled with sporadic updates, but for the most part, it was just me, the city, and the haunting echoes of footsteps on empty sidewalks. The call came in around 2 a.m. A disturbance reported at the edge of town. Now, these calls weren't uncommon, usually just teens messing around or folks having a bit too much to drink. But this night was different. As I rolled up to the scene, the first thing I noticed was the eerie quiet that hung in the air. The street was lined with abandoned buildings, their windows shattered and boarded up like the ghosts of the city's past were watching. I parked the cruiser, the engine ticking as it cooled in the stillness. I stepped out into the night, the only sound the echo of my boots on the pavement. The dispatch had mentioned a mysterious figure lurking in the shadows, and as I scanned the area, a chill ran down my spine. The darkness seemed denser, like it held secrets that the feeble glow of my flashlight couldn't penetrate. I approached the source of the disturbance, an old warehouse with a history as murky as the night itself. The door creaked open, protesting the intrusion. Inside, the air hung heavy with the scent of decay, like the building itself was exhaling memories of a time long forgotten. As I ventured deeper into the warehouse, the shadows seemed to dance and contort, playing tricks on my tired mind. I could feel the weight of eyes on me, watching from the corners of the room. The radio on my shoulder buzzed with static, a sound that echoed the unease in my gut. That's when I saw him, a silhouette, barely discernible against the darkness. He stood in the center of the room, motionless, like a specter summoned by the city's forgotten past. I called out, demanding he show his hands, but he remained silent. The beam of my flashlight revealed a figure cloaked in tattered clothing, his face obscured by the shadows of a wide-brimmed hat. The air grew colder, and I could see my breath as I cautiously approached. The guy seemed unfazed, his gaze fixed on something unseen. I ordered him to turn around, but he refused. The tension in the room escalated, each step toward the mysterious figure feeling like a journey into the unknown. He began to mutter something under his breath, words that creeped me out to the core. It wasn't just the language, it was the tone, a guttural whisper that seemed to reverberate through the very walls of the warehouse. As I closed the gap, the figure finally turned to face me. His eyes, illuminated by the cold light of my flashlight, bore into mine. They were vacant, like windows to a void that swallowed all reason. He spoke, his voice a haunting symphony of disjointed phrases and cryptic warnings. "You can't stop what's coming," he uttered, the words hanging in the air like a malevolent incantation. I radioed for backup, the urgency in my voice betraying the unease that had settled in the pit of my stomach. The figure continued his eerie monologue, weaving tales of impending darkness and the inevitability of a reckoning. As I waited for backup, the atmosphere in the warehouse shifted. The air seemed to thicken, and the temperature plummeted. The figure's words grew more frenzied, his gaze fixed on something beyond my comprehension. Backup arrived just in time, flooding the warehouse with the harsh glare of multiple flashlights. But as the room brightened, the mysterious figure evaporated like a wisp of smoke, leaving behind only the echoes of his cryptic warnings. The other officers and I exchanged bewildered looks at each other, unsure of what had just transpired. The warehouse, once a stage for a surreal encounter, returned to its silent slumber. As we combed through the area, there was no trace of the mysterious figure. It was as if he had melted into the shadows, leaving only the lingering sense that something otherworldly had graced that abandoned warehouse. Still, to this day, the memory of that night haunts me. The footsteps in the quiet streets, the creepy warehouse, and the enigmatic figure with eyes that seemed to hold the secrets of the night. It's a tale I often share with fellow officers, a reminder that the line between reality and the unknown is thinner than we'd like to believe. Thanks for watching. Don't miss out on more spine-chilling tales. Subscribe now for weekly scares. Hit that red button and join our journey into the unknown.